Good afternoon, everybody. Hope you can hear me above the noise of London traffic. Here we are, right in the City of London. In fact, we're facing the oldest piece of the City of London, which is one of the defences of the Roman London, the Roman Wall. There are actually 12 or 13 places around the London Wall which are still evident today, and this is a remains of a Roman fortress. We are facing the external western side of the Wall of London, which continues along the road London Wall until we get to the Aldersgate. And Aldersgate, of course, is one of the many gates surrounding the ancient Roman city of London. We have on the west of Aldersgate, we have Newgate and Ludgate, and to the east we have Moorgate, Bishopsgate, Aldgate, and round to the Tower of London, which is the major bastion of the defence of the ancient city of London. Now, why are we making so much of the Wall of London? Because until about 1650, or just perhaps shortly before the Great Fire of London, nobody was really allowed to live outside the walls of London. So the gates were actually functional right up to the 17th century, after which they became one by one dismantled and destroyed. But people did not live outside the City of London. This was the central place of habitation of all the people in London. So naturally, the numbers didn't grow substantially until after the Great Fire, the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, when people spread out beyond the walls. The point we're making here is that the Jewish community was brought into the City of London relatively in the medieval times, straight after the conquest of William the Conqueror in 1071, 1072. He brought with him Jews who would help him with the exchequer, with lending of money, and they were all settled in this area. So if we point the camera into this direction here, towards Gresham Street and Wood Street and Milk Street, that is where the Jewish community was based. So inside the walls, of course. And when one builds a Jewish community, as the Jews know, Jewish people know for many thousands of years, there are four institutions which are brought into the community straight away. That's the synagogue, the social welfare, the cemetery, and the education. And all of these, the Jewish community concerned themselves with, even though they were numbered only a few hundreds to start with. Now, William the Conqueror brought the Jews from France, from Rouen, which is in Normandy. He was a Duke of Normandy, and he decided that they would be very useful to him. He brought a number of wealthy families over here and settled them all here. Actually, when one has to start a community, the cemetery is one of the first places one needs to establish. So we're walking across now to another part of the Wall of London where the cemetery was established. And as you know, cemeteries in London's history were not allowed to be built inside any walls. So straight outside the wall of the London, in this corner here, next to Cripplegate, you will find the Jewish cemetery. So let's go across there now. Just here the wall continues. There's another bastion of the original Roman wall, but of course it's been renewed over the hundreds of years by other structures. However, a lot of this area was actually, all this wall was buried until the bombing of the Second World War revealed some of the foundations of the ancient Cripplegate. It was a fortuitous consequence of the bombing, brought all this to light. So we're walking to the Cripplegate area now. Coming into Wood Street now, Roman house. This is a remnant of the Roman wall. We'll see very briefly next to where the Cripplegate was standing, another beautiful piece of Roman wall which has been preserved. Over here you can see there's a garden called St Alfred's Garden. Here is the site of the Cripplegate, demolished in 1760, the same time as Aldgate was demolished. And it's now worth seeing the map here and the picture of the gate to show you what it used to be like. The London Wall walk, it actually takes you all the way from the Tower of London around the walls. That's the Bevis Marks Synagogue where we went on the previous tour, and continues along the road which is actually called London Wall to the Cripplegate Bastion, which we're going to see now, and the Roman fort, and then it goes back towards the Blackfriars area, which is the other gate, which is next to Ludgate and Newgate, this side of the Thames. And here we have how the fields looked, just absolute countryside. Cripplegate was actually a Roman fort and continued to be used until the 1600s. Now the Cripplegate continues, the walls continue here. We'll see a most beautiful piece now. The whole area, as I said, was bombed in the Second World War, and the Barbican community was created, completely rebuilt, completely replanned, and takes us into a most beautiful area, which was the site of the Jewish cemetery. If we look here, it even says a church has stood on this site since Saxon times, St Giles Cripplegate. The present church, which dates from 1090, was extended. So there was cooperation with the Christians where the Jews put their cemetery, and we'll show you the space now. Church. Here are the walls of the city. So beyond this wall, land was allocated. We can see a corner tower here, which is beautiful. according to all the documents, there was a street here below this where the City of London School for Girls is today. Below this was a street called Jewin Street. Nobody knows where that is today, but I found a map from the 1920s, this is before the bombing, with all the old streets actually marked out. And Jewin Street, the City of London School is actually here, and Jewin Street is right underneath. So we're actually down here now. There is a piece of garden left, which was called the Jews' Garden. So here was the cemetery. This is where everybody was buried in the Jewish community in the whole of the United Kingdom until 1177. After 1177, the king, who was at that time Henry II, he allowed the Jews to build cemeteries in every other town where they had communities after 1177. Before that, the Jews used to be brought from the various towns, York, Exeter, Peterborough, wherever they were, to London to be buried before 1177. So for 100 years, this was the central cemetery of the Jewish community of England at the time. Now, what's interesting is that there was a pub we just passed on the way, which used to be called the Crowder's Well. Now, Crowder's Well, in literature, was referred to the Jewish cemetery. Interesting, because in Bristol you have a Crowder Terrace, and you have a Crowd's Well in Oxford and in Winchester as well. All those are attached to the Jewish cemetery. So nobody knows the meaning of the word Crowder, but it implies that there was something there. The well, of course, was the natural source of water which was needed as a mikveh for burying Jewish dead. Everywhere a cemetery is, there is a natural source of water, and that was absolutely essential, of course. So all the towns where they had Jewish communities had to be locating their cemetery next to a natural spring of water. And here we had the well over here. Now this is the garden, and Jewin Street is still on the ancient documents, but of course doesn't exist anymore, except a piece of garden. Now it is said that when they dug this up after the Second World War destruction, they found some gravestones. This was done, there were 2 stones which were found and were transferred to the Bodleian Library in Oxford. Nobody knows to this day whether they're still there, whether they were preserved, whether it was after the Second World War or just found loose stones which had been previously from pillaged the cemetery beforehand. We're not sure, and I haven't yet been able to establish that. But the other interesting thing is there was a Jewish tombstone found in Ludgate, which was destroyed in 1596. So the king who expelled the Jewish community in 1290, who was Edward I, had this whole cemetery excavated and used the stones for various purposes to build up the walls of London or the gates of London. This was known for sure. So this area is the tiny piece of garden which is left, which we could say is the remnant of the Jewish community, of Jewish cemetery. But now we're going to go this way towards and we'll see where the Jewish community lived, inside the walls next to Wood Street. We'll go there now. up until 10 years ago, had the name Crowder's Well. No idea why it was changed, rather a shame. We're walking down Wood Street, which is one of the central streets of the Jewish community. Altogether, the number was very small. We're just talking about no more than maybe 1,500 Jews at the maximum in the medieval community. When you talk about a total UK English population of 2 million, it was also about we had about 1.75%, which is about the same as the population today of Jewish people in the population of the country. So the numbers are totally different from what we imagined. But these were obviously significant enough to be recorded in history. It was enough to bother the kings and queens of the time. The Jews were subject to the whim of the king. They were subject of the king. He actually looked after them. They couldn't actually be permitted to fit in with the feudal system in the country of the medieval England, and they weren't allowed to join the guilds of Christian work professions. So they were totally under the aegis of the king. Many of the poor Jews were settled next to the Tower of London, where they were absolutely protected by the crown. That's where the king lived in those days, in the Tower of London. So
way to cross the road.
Now, I found a map from the Anglo-Jewish Historical Exhibition of 1887, which actually I've reproduced here, and it shows you a drawing of all the streets where the Jewish community was housed, even the numbers of the houses owned by the wealthy Jews. Some had stone brick houses, and they are named here, which is amazing to see, the people who actually lived here, and their names of their families. Most of them had French names, so they had they spoke French. In fact, that was one of the languages of the country at that time. Everybody spoke, in the intellectual circles, they spoke English and French quite freely. We get to Gresham Street, and then I'll stop and I'll show you the map. Pretty quiet now. Sometimes I come on a Sunday and it's totally empty, and even now a lot of people haven't returned to work. You can see it's very, very quiet all round. We'll stand here and I'll just show you the map because it's fascinating. This is how it looks. If I can show you, we have here, it's called Cataton Street, which is actually Gresham Street today. Here we have Milk Street, here we have Wood Street. This is Wood Street here, recorded from 1290, same name. Love Lane, still here, 1290. Milk Street, still here. Ironmonger Lane, still here. Old Jewry, we will see that in a minute, is there. That's where the great synagogue was based. And I'll show you also on this map, you'll see numbers of dwellings. And these are the names of families. For example, Moshe Fi Eli. Fis is the son of Eli, Ben Eli. Gamliel de Oxen of Oxford, right? And we have Bateman Fis Kress. Various names, all listed. These people owned properties, and they were quite wealthy. Obviously, they were the main money lenders to the crown, and one of the major activities of the Jews, as I mentioned before, was to lend money. The Christians were not allowed to lend money, and this was their success and their downfall. Every time the Christians found themselves in debt, they blamed the Jews, naturally, for being users and for usury, which meant they were able to lend money at interest. Some of the interest payments were high. Very often the king would, depending on whether he was well disposed to the Jews or not, would decide to confiscate the money or confiscate the properties. They were absolutely at the whim of the crown, depending on different ages through the medieval period from 1077 until 1290. Now, if we walk along Gresham Street here, there is Milk Street, and in Milk Street there were one house after another were recorded as Jewish homes, and in fact in some excavations of 1976 they found a mikveh in the basement of a home here, which is in its entirety has been reconstructed and is today in the Jewish Museum in Camden. And it's definitely worth looking at that. It's a most amazing find. But this is really the only piece of architecture which was remaining from the Jewish community. Nothing else remained. There were a few artifacts which were found also during these excavations, and one of them was a Shabbat lamp holder, which is in the London Museum in Barbican, and there were some coins. Some coins were found. Some of them were from Bar Kochba. So the Jews, they said, used to keep the best coins in their safes. They weren't fake coins, and they were proper hoards of money, because this is how they used to lend the money. They used to have hoards of gold and hoards of coins. There were, of course, no other means of money in those days. And it is said they found a Bar Kochba coin in Aldersgate, which is just along the road here, in one of the houses which was excavated. This is Milk Street. All the way along this street, according to this map, there were houses. And we've got here 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 Milk Street, all named. Amazing to have this information available. Of course, all these houses were confiscated by the king, King Edward I, when he expelled the community in 1290. Nothing was left behind to the Jewish community. They took all the property and used it, of course, for the exchequer, which was needed to finance wars and the lavish lifestyle of the courtiers and the royal family. Let's move along Gresham Street. We'll see some more interesting places. Here we come to the church of St. Lawrence Jewry. This is built in memory of the Jewish community to show how important it was. Here we are. Worth reading this plaque here. St. Lawrence Jewry is so called because the original 12th century church stood on the eastern side of the city, then occupied by the Jewish community. The church, built in 1136, was destroyed in the Great Fire of London of 1666. The building which replaced it was designed by Sir Christopher Wren in 1680, almost completely destroyed by fire in 1940. This time, as a result of action by the king's enemies, it was restored in 1957 in the tradition of Wren's building. St. Lawrence Jewry is now the church of the Corporation of London. And this is the church where the Lord Mayor of London, who is goes through his investiture ceremony, has his services placed here. Of course, when the Lord Mayor of London was a Jew, and there were a number of times, they had the service brought to the Bevis Mark Synagogue. So this is a parallel institution. We don't know what will happen when we have a Muslim Lord Mayor of London. We'll see when that happens. Now here we're going to go into the Guildhall Plaza. This is the Guildhall of London, which is the ancient town hall, if you like, or city hall. This facade is actually amazing. It's from 1410. It's one of the last remaining medieval buildings existing in this country and is still complete, the whole facade. Now, the Guildhall was the place, in fact, of the government of London, and there was also the central courts of justice in the time of Queen Elizabeth, and she invited a Jewish doctor to come to. Actually, she was treated by a Dr. Lopez, Rodriguez Lopez, who afterwards was found to be meddling in various affairs, political affairs, and eventually was tried in the Guildhall and executed. Queen Elizabeth allowed his wife to inherit his fortune as a mark of mercy towards the family, because she had a soft spot for him as her physician. There were many times after the expulsion in 1290 when Jews were allowed to come into the country as physicians and certainly as advisors to King Henry VIII. He brought two rabbis in from Italy when he was going through his divorce. He wanted to discuss what Talmudic law would say about allowing a divorce, seeing that Catholics weren't allowed to divorce. So at that point he broke away and formed, as we know, the Protestant Church. So this is again, the permission of Jews were brought back in again under various circumstances by the royal family. So here there's another plaque about St. Lawrence Jewry here. Probably the same. Yes, it's the same wording here. Okay, now we'll go along here. Along Gresham Street there's another place where there were a mikveh was found. Gresham Street. Here we are. A mikveh was found here as well, and there was a synagogue. According to this map, there was a synagogue here, and there were houses number 12 and 13, so it was all documented. Just the other side of St. Lawrence Jewry Church, which was also listed on this map from 1290. So this is very interesting. Now we're going to go along Ironmonger Lane, which is a little alleyway, and all these streets were occupied by the Jewish community. Now, of course, where did the Jews who were not wealthy, where did they survive? They worked in the markets. The market, of course, was just up the road. It was Cheapside. That was the market. They actually traded and were very prominent in the market of Cheapside. And that was the central business district of the City of London, the Cheapside. So they used to have market stalls here, they used to be trading here, and the wealthy Jews looked after the poor Jews, as perhaps today you could say the same thing. It's all, as a welfare system was introduced and was able to be, although they weren't living in a ghetto, they were living closely enough to each other to be looked after by each other. Now this is a church here called St. Olave's, which is also named St. Olave's Jewry. This was a church here. In fact, the church tower has been moved. The church is here, but the tower was moved to Stoke Newington. That's where the church is today, in North London. This was called St. Olave's Jewry. We're coming now to Old Jewry, which is the street where the major buildings were. There were no fixed synagogues until 1230. So for 150 years, the Jews prayed in their own houses or in small minyanim, which were not established. But now we're coming to the street called Old Jewry, and this is the most interesting area because it was known throughout history as the centre of the Jewish community. And here's the street, and here straight across it from us is the site of the great synagogue. It stood here. So 1230 it was built. 1272 was then taken away by King Edward I and sold or given to the Christian order of monks. That was the site of the great synagogue. It's right behind here, and next to it, along this side of the wall, was the Jewish school. The Jewish school was the Schola Judaeum, was along here. Now we're coming into this street here, which is interesting, Frederick's Place. Just as an aside, this is where Benjamin Disraeli worked. In fact, there's a beautiful plaque here. The whole street has been preserved as a piece of ancient architecture. Not part of medieval London, but interesting to see, even so. He was, of course, of Jewish origin. So this whole area was part of the Old Jewry area here. Now we're going to come down to Cheapside. And there were many stories of kings who were well disposed. I said King William the Conqueror, of course, was well disposed. He brought the Jews here. William Rufus didn't know much about Judaism. He actually encouraged the Jews and the Christians to get together and have discussions. He, of course, promised that if the Jews win a debate, he promises to convert to Judaism. And, of course, he made sure that that would never happen. So that was the story about William II, William Rufus. Then came along Henry I, and he was very well disposed towards the Jews, and he reigned for 30 or 40 years. He was he allowed them to thrive, and until 1230, there were very few incidents, one could say, which showed the hostility of the local population to the Jewish community. After that, things started to happen. There were various tragedies happened. There was a boy called William in Norwich who was found dead, and the Christian community blamed the Jews. There was a blood libel. It was just before Passover. They had to use his blood to bake the matzot, and that was a story which created a riot. There was another story of when King Richard II had his coronation. That was Richard I, sorry, in 1189. The coronation was on Sunday, September the 3rd, in 1189 in Westminster Abbey. The Jews were instructed specifically not to attend. However, some wanted to show their loyalty to the king and wanted to bring presents, and they tried to get into the abbey during the ceremony, and a riot ensued. And then there was some pogroms, and some 30 Jews were murdered that night. And from then on, 1189, the community, you could say, went downhill because the Crusades were in their height of activity. There were Jews who came from different towns to collect together to join the Crusades, and on their way they would be murdering or pillaging Jewish homes, or be setting fire to Jewish homes. This happened frequently in various towns throughout the country, and up to the time of Edward I, there were possible periods of calm, but the Jewish community became increasingly poor because the taxes were levied higher and higher on the Jewish community, and they weren't able to survive and thrive in the same way they did in the first 100 years after they arrived in this country. Now we'll go along here towards the Bank of England. There's an interesting story about the Bank of England. But along here, this is Cheapside. This is where the market would be. So here was the central trading street of the ancient city of London. in this court here is called Grocers Hall Court. Right at the end is where the great synagogue would be. So we just have to imagine, unfortunately we can't see anything, but there is a school of catering, and there's a catering college. I don't know whether it's actually functioning at the moment, but the building that we saw from Old Jewry backed onto this area. There was a school, and a yeshiva was here. This is where they were able to conduct their affairs. There are a few hundred Jews who lived at the time in this area. Now we're going to come to the Mansion House, which is the home of the Lord Mayor of London. Of course, there have been many Jews Lord Mayors of London over the years, and the city was at various periods quite good to the Jewish community. When I say the city, we're talking now about the return of the Jewish community, because after expulsion they weren't allowed to return here until 1655, after Oliver Cromwell decided that he wanted them back here, because the kings of England didn't really make any effort to bring the Jews back here. But the interesting thing is that they were able to gain the respect of the community again once they came back and went into the city. Now there's a street along here called Lombard Street, which is this way. After the Jews were expelled in 1290, there was a vacuum, so to speak, in the financial institutions of the city. There was nobody to handle the financial affairs, and people from Lombard, which is Italy, Lombardy, were brought in here, and it is rumoured that some of those were Marano Jews. After the expulsion from Spain in 1492, so that was already 200 years later, the Jews started coming back here, and they came, and Lombard Street is the centre of where they set up their businesses. Now here we have the Bank of England. Now this...
Do they control the interest rate?
This actually was built on land owned by no less than Aaron of Lincoln, who was the wealthiest man in England in the period where he lived. He died in 1186. He was 1130 to 1186. Now those dates were important because the Jews were in their heyday at this point. He owned this land here. When he died, it was purported he was worth equivalent today of £20 billion. He was by far the richest. He was on a par with the royal family, and very often he would lend money for various buildings, various infrastructure projects. In those days, the biggest buildings were churches. The Jewish community, including Aaron of Lincoln, would be responsible for finding the money for building, for example, Westminster Abbey, Peterborough Cathedral. These buildings were financed by Jewish money. It's absolutely ironic, but this is how it worked. The Christians were happy to take the money. Afterwards, they blamed the Jews for various ills that befell the communities. But they were very influenced by Aaron of Lincoln, who had in fact, there's a building in Lincoln today, which is Aaron's house, which is still standing. And there's a number of medieval houses still standing in Lincoln today. So the Jewish community of Lincoln was actually led by him, and he was a very prominent personality throughout the country. There's another prominent Jewish personality, that was Lycorissia. She was a banker, a woman banker, and in fact they were way ahead of their time. The Jewish women, some were involved in lending money, and Lycorissia actually lived in Winchester. So there was a Jewish community. She was also allowed to practice her profession, and there's a story about her also marrying and divorcing and marrying again somebody called David from Oxford. These are all documented, and I'll be happy to send you the sources of these stories. But the story goes that once Aaron of Lincoln passed away, again the community declined, didn't have the influence that they used to have. They were increasingly taxed by the kings, and became poorer and poorer, and became much more difficult to survive. Even though we could say they allowed a period of where the community was, the synagogue was built, but they weren't as wealthy as they were in the first 100 years of the community in England. So now we're going to just finish off, because I also want to talk about the Royal Exchange. The Royal Exchange is an area which is the old stock exchange, so to speak, of grain and of food products and commodities, and the Jews were allowed in here as soon as they came in from the 1655 period. Already there were numbers of Jews that became involved in the financial affairs. They were Spanish, Portuguese Jews, and then came other Jewish immigrants from Hamburg, from Germany, who were also interested in trade. Hamburg being a big trading city, they became involved in the Royal Exchange, and they were permitted to have a certain number of members, Jews, in the Royal Exchange. So that's an interesting piece of history. There are stories about how they got involved in business of ill repute as well around the back alleys of the Royal Exchange. There are coffee houses around the back, and there are also areas where they were involved in various illicit trades. So there's a bad side as well, of course, to every story. So that's the Royal Exchange. Anyway, that's the end of the tour from the point of view of the medieval community. If we look down this street here, just while we're here, we come to St Swithin's Lane, which is the site of the Rothschild Bank. We've got a few minutes, we can take you down there. There's a very interesting painting in the front window of the Rothschild Bank. And this is Lombard Street, as I told you before. We're going down St Swithin's Lane. Moses Montefiore lived down there, and so did one of the Rothschilds. It's very interesting to know that it's residential as well as business, all in the same area. This is the monument over there to the Great Fire of London. All within 1 square mile. We can walk this whole thing in an hour or two. It's very easy, and it's fascinating to walk around the city any time of the day. So St Swithin's Lane is down here. This railway is the Rothschild Bank. No names, nobody knows, but it's here. In the front entrance is a massive painting of Moshe Rabbeinu, a tapestry and a painting. Here he is on Har Sinai.
Sorry, Mike, you can't take pictures in the building.
Okay. I just want to show you the mezuzah on the front of the bank. And here's the coat of arms of the Rothschild family. Mezuzah on this door here. Can't take pictures, I'm afraid. Here's the Rothschild family here, 5 sides.
Yeah.
Okay.
In the church you allow. Take a picture of the church, but not a building. Yeah?
Thank you. So it's called New Court. And then further down here, Disraeli and Montefiore lived at different times. These two buildings here, 13, number 13. These two houses here. These two houses here were occupied by Montefiore and Disraeli at one time during history. And that takes us very nicely to the end of the tour. So I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was a lot of information there. You can certainly contact me again if you want more information about any of the stories I've given you, or any stories which I omitted. I'm sure there are many other stories which people have. And thank you very much.